Hi, welcome to Masters of the Musiverse, and what is probably the last episode of this season. Although I'm thinking about recording something that is a little bit reflective of what the season one has meant to me and what I'm planning for the future. Because I got some good plans for this channel and this podcast. Not quite ready to do that, so let's just focus on this conversation with David Davis. David is a teacher in Minnetonka here in Minnesota. He is one of the semifinalists for the Minnesota Teacher of the Year, and it is just so obvious in this conversation. He is intelligent, he's reflective on his teaching, he is kind, he's funny. I think you're going to see all this is just very apparent. I enjoyed this so much. In fact, this actually didn't even really start as an interview. He just wanted to talk to me a little bit about how we teach. I enjoyed it so much. And so I wanted to share it with you, this conversation with David Davis.
Let's just talk. Like, what were your early music experiences?
Yeah. So I feel like my first thought that comes to mind is my family wasn't super musical, but I did grow up in parochial schools my whole life. So K through 12 was all Wisconsin Lutheran schools, and in the Lutheranism I grew up in, like singing and music was every day. Like I remember the teacher every morning going to the piano and we'd all sing a hymn for the beginning of class. Um, I actually have a what I think is kind of a funny story of I feel like my kindergarten, first, second, and third grade teachers were all like really good at piano, and we just always all four parts, and everyone was singing along. And then Mr. Schmidt, my fourth grade teacher, like a sweet guy, one of my favorite elementary teachers, but he was kind of a hunt and peck piano player. And I remember after like a couple of weeks of doing hymns with him just like playing the melody, I raised my hand as a fourth grader. I was like, Mr. Schmidt, next time can you do like the cool all four part playing? Like, why do you keep doing the one note at a time part? Because I didn't understand that he didn't really know how to play piano, and he was just like, okay, David, I'll try.
Poor guy.
Yeah. Well, now in hindsight, like, oh, I didn't even realize, but otherwise, I feel like as a young kid, I had the standard recorder in fourth grade, the opportunity to do band in fifth grade. Um, I never took piano lessons because the piano teacher at my school had a reputation for being strict. So I ended up like self-teaching myself piano, which again, as a reflective experience is kind of interesting how I went through teaching myself piano and had a couple roadblocks along the way, but overcame them, and now I feel like I'm a decent piano player.
Sure.
And then
Any roadblocks like to speak of? I mean, what kind of things you talking about?
well, I remember I think I was in third grade or something, and I had middle C as the wrong note. I think I thought A was C.
Oh,
So I
sure,
remember
sure.
like reading simple melodies and thinking I was doing them right until an adult came by and was like, oh, actually, that's the note for C. And I was like, oh, and then it sounded like that's why it sounded weird. um,
Yeah,
then,
that's a pretty that's a good one to get fixed.
yeah, right. And then in school, I chose the saxophone as my instrument, so I was used to treble. So I think it was around maybe seventh or eighth grade when I took the plunge and I told myself, okay, and up until then, I was playing all treble clef piano with both hands because I didn't know how to read bass clef. And then I took the plunge and I was like, okay, I'm going to teach myself bass clef so I can play real piano. And that was a really slow process of figuring, like, I remember like the first song I ever did with both hands was Edelweiss, like a simplified version of Edelweiss.
Yeah.
I remember like the first note was like a C in the bass clef, and I had to like start on middle C and count my way down. Oh, it's C. Dun 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 dun. So those were the kind of roadblocks. But just as we all know, the more repetition, like it just became, I got used to it. So
Yeah. So you said you already had said that you played saxophone in high school. So, like what like what were your influences for that? Like like who taught you sax or who inspired you?
Yeah, so the parochial school I went to, there was a woman who just volunteered as a band director. So my first experience was a 5 through 8 band. Um, and I think I originally really wanted to do trumpet. And then when we did the tryouts, I couldn't really do the buzzing thing. So I remember feeling kind of disappointed that like, oh, trumpet's harder than I thought it would be. But then my best friend at the time chose saxophone. So I was like, okay, I'll try that one since Brandon chose it. And then I could get a sound. I was like, oh, Brandon chose it and I can play it. So, and here I am. Now I have a performance degree in saxophone.
Were any notable experiences in high school that like kind of started triggering you towards profession in music?
Well, so again, parochial school is pretty small. So my high school had about 400 students total, and it was located literally in the middle of a cornfield. So kind of out in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin is where I went to high school. But I think I just got really lucky that both the band teacher and the choir teacher were really awesome music educators, like not just good at their craft, but also just like great human beings. My high school band director is now the band director at Interlochen. So I keep in touch with him a bit. And anyways, so my music experiences in high school were pretty solid, I'd say.
Yeah.
And I was never really good at sports. So once I kind of realized that music was easy for me to pick up, that kind of became my identity. And other people in high school kind of like, oh yeah, David's really good at music. So that intrinsically motivated me to want to keep putting time into it. And I think by junior year, I decided like, oh yeah, I'm definitely really like this music thing is, yeah, I had joined every musical thing in my high school, like percussion ensemble and clarinet choir and jazz band, like every musical thing I could do, I was in. So I think that kind of led me to like, oh, I should keep doing this.
So when you, like leaving high school, were you set on education, or was it just like I want music to be part of my profession?
Yeah, I think that's where my origin story maybe is different than some other educators, because at that time in my life, I was dead set against being a music educator. I wanted nothing to do with teaching music. And I think as I reflect on it, I think my thought process was I had been brought up in the traditional band way where you kind of think of everything being technique and reading music. Um, and that came easy to me, but I think I thought that that's all music was. So I then thought that, well, music education is just this cycle of people who aren't good enough to break out and be a performer. So they just are a music teacher, and then they teach other people who aren't good enough to break out. So they become music teachers. It's just a cycle of music teachers. And I was like, I want to be the person that breaks out of that cycle and actually becomes a musician. Um, so obviously, I don't think that way anymore, but that's how I used to think.
Yeah.
That's why I wanted nothing to do with music education, and I went only for saxophone performance.
Yeah, it's funny that we, like I know I've had people that run into people that have had similar thoughts, and really the truth is it's about a skill set. I've met lots of amazing performers that cannot educate worth a darn, and that, yeah, so that's the truth of it. So that's interesting. So how far in did you get doing performance as a mindset?
Yeah, I graduated with perform, and I still consider myself a performer. But my junior year in college, when I had like a life-changing experience that made me fall in love with teaching. But up until then, like my trajectory was I'm going to graduate and either go on to become a saxophone professor or audition for the military bands.
Yeah.
I actually lived in Washington, D.C. for a couple of years, and I auditioned with the Navy band and the Marine band. So those were interesting experiences and kind of gave me a new view on what it's like if you actually were to become a professional saxophonist in one of those. And,
So what was that experience that your junior year that kind of changed things?
it was one course called Instrumental Pedagogy that my saxophone professor, there was just a small cohort of like me and maybe like 4 other people who were performance people, but so we weren't required to take any education courses. But our professor was like, well, like even as a performer, you're probably going to have to give lessons throughout your life. So he's like, I'm gonna start a class called Instrumental Pedagogy, and I recommend you guys sign up for it. So I was like, okay, I guess. Like, yeah, I probably love to give lessons. So I kind of entered into it begrudgingly. But man, this professor just like blew my mind with like, I think it came down to the science of pedagogy, like things like simplification, scaffolding, um, the zone of proximal development, like all those learning theory things I never knew about. And I feel like before that class, I naively thought that good teachers were just like nice people. And it never occurred to me that there's actually like pedagogical skills and pedagogical science behind what they're doing. And
Yeah.
that's what kind of blew my mind. Is like, whoa, there's so much science behind this. And that's why Professor Jordan is so good at teaching lessons, because he simplifies and he scaffolds for me. And when I can't get something, he demonstrates rather than just lecturing at me. And,
Yeah.
so and then I had a cognitive development course that then dug more into the science of how the brain learns, and I was just fascinated by all the learning theories. And so I think does that answer your question?
Yeah. That's interesting because that's for me, it was in a way similar, but it was more about going through junior high and high school and having these teachers that were so amazing that I wanted to be like them. You know, like if he's amazing, then that's the job I want. And so like it morphed from being like I was gonna, oh, I'm gonna do social studies and history, to I'm gonna do music, because it was the teachers I had along the way. So I'm probably lucky that the last teacher I had that inspired me in high school was a music teacher, because who knows what I would have picked otherwise.
Yeah, yeah, and again, in hindsight, like that, I think my story is similar. Where yeah, those teachers were amazing. I think at the time I was just so invested in becoming a saxophone performer that I felt lucky that I had a professor who was like he brought me from 0 to 60 in like a year. Because at the time I just thought, wow, this guy's a great teacher. But now I understand it's because he was using all these scientifically backed ways of helping me grow. And just anytime I got stuck, he just immediately knew what to do to fix it. Like when I entered in freshman year of college, I knew nothing about intonation. Like my whole high school experience was my teacher telling us we were out of tune, and I would just move my mouthpiece one direction and just hope that that was correct. And if you said, "Oh, you're still out of tune," "Oh, I must have done it the wrong way," move it the other way. It was just complete guesswork.
Yeah.
So then my freshman year was so much intonation, and within a year, like going from like tone deafness to being able to play chords in tune on a saxophone, like whew, I hope to eventually become a teacher who can do that.
So we should give a shout out to this teacher. Who is this great teacher that you had?
Yeah, Steve Jordan.
And
He,
I'm sorry, I think I missed what college you went to.
yeah, Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin.
Oh yeah, okay. Did you
So
play
yeah,
the jazz bands there?
I played under Fred Sturm, if you know.
Yes, that had to be an experience.
Yeah. I actually was lucky enough to record a CD with Fred Sturm and the Radiohead project.
Okay, no, you're part of that?
I'm the Barry sax player in that.
Shut up.
Yeah.
Body Snatchers has to be my newest, like I just want to play it every year.
Yeah. It was so fun. Like having the real studio experience, like the headphones half on and all the microphones everywhere, and not breathing too loud. And yeah, it was so fun. And yeah, Body Snatchers out of all of them was like our favorite one to play. Um,
Yeah, so
teaching
where does your path kind of start changing, and like how do you get certified to be an educator? And
Yeah. So before moving to DC, I graduated with a performance degree, took a year off to just kind of work, and then decided that I just fell in love with teaching so much after that one class that I just kept growing in interest in education. So I decided my 6th year in Appleton to go back and take all the education courses I needed to get licensed. Um, so it was kind of interesting being like a 6th year in a 4-year college where I was like 24, but I was in the same class as like 18-year-olds. But I was able to accomplish all that in 1 year. So after that, I was licensed, and then I could start teaching them.
so what's your first teaching gig after that then?
Yeah, I was actually lucky enough that while I was still in Appleton, I got hired as a assistant part-time band director at a rural public school. So I was actually teaching, like, and making money before I was even licensed, just working under a band teacher. And I feel like that, like, if I was in charge of a music education program, I feel like I would try to turn it, like, if it's 90% textbook, 10% practicum and student teaching, I would turn it around to 90% in the schools and then 10% textbook. Because being able to teach like authentically in a school at the same time that I was learning about it was such a great experience. And because I could take like the theories and everything I was learning about and like utilize them in a real context, not like a fake, like, oh, my college peer is going to pretend to not know what they're doing. This is like actually high schoolers who don't know what they're doing, and I actually have to help them.
Yeah. Yeah,
So that was my
funny.
first one.
That's so interesting because I just did another interview. It's coming out this Friday, and we had a very similar conversation about that. Um, Essentially, what you're saying is that, boy, if someone could spend a whole year in a school, essentially, because I don't know about you, but September and May are totally different and on all levels, and every month in between. Um, I, I would love to see some kind of reform happening at universities to make that possible.
Yeah, I heard a story. I think it was on NPR. A university in Michigan. I don't. Maybe it was University of Michigan, but they were trying to treat their education program a little bit more like a medical residency,
Oh yeah,
with the mindset of like, if someone's going to become a surgeon, like, you want them to know what they're doing, like on day one. And like, shouldn't education be the same way? Like, they have so much power in people's lives, and like all the evidence out there of like, what is it, like 30% of teachers leave within the first 5 years because they don't feel ready. And so I think this university's mindset was, we should treat it like a residency so that on day one a teacher goes in their classroom and feels prepared. And I was like, yeah, I totally agree with that philosophy, and I wish we could turn education into a more serious approach than it seems like it is right now.
yeah. I was lucky. So my first job, where I worked at for 2 years, I was the only band person. I did have in my second year another music colleague to work with. Um, but it was my second job when I was in my third year of teaching. I got in a much bigger department. Now all of a sudden there's, three band directors and two orchestra directors and three choir people. And all of a sudden now you get to see great teaching, and you get to talk to people. It's like, okay, your kids sounded fantastic. And I don't care what it was, choir or orchestra. It's like, how'd you get them to sound fantastic? And that's when I really started growing. And yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So what are some of your performance experiences?
Like personally performance experiences or
Yeah, you were asking me about my saxophone
yeah.
stuff. So,
um well, for one, I went to college like thinking like music education was it, and then I found myself, it's interesting because in a way vice versa from you, I found myself challenged because all of a sudden my freshman year I did a half recital, and the addiction of performance like hit me hard. And
yeah.
I still have it. I love performing. And I just find different ways to do it now, both on trombone, and I do some singing with my guitar around the area too.
Yeah.
And I started about my junior year, I started reconsidering like, okay, maybe I'll go on and get my master's degree in performance. And I loved everything. I loved doing recitals. I love playing the band. I got to play in the symphony orchestra. That was fantastic. I got to do jazz band. And it was, yeah, so I started seriously considering it, but in the end, I kind of felt like I'd experienced too many light bulb moments with students.
Hmm.
I had a little private studio in college, and then in my student teaching and stuff. And it was like, I think that addiction was stronger for me than the performance one, is like seeing those kids. And I remember my first light bulb moment. It wasn't my student teaching. It was whatever we called it beforehand. We're there for 2 weeks, and it was a piano class. They were like, I don't know, they were young elementary kids. And he was playing all the right hand stuff, and then he was playing all the left hand stuff. I'm like, that's very good, but why'd you do it at the same time? And he looked at the music, and all of a sudden, and like, boy, if anybody in their lives has not experienced that, one, you're probably not an educator. being there for those light bulb moments is just a thrilling thing to be a part of.
Yeah, isn't that
Uh,
awesome?
yeah, yeah. And then when I got my first, it's so interesting because we have almost these parallel stories in a way, but just a different take on them. Because I got done with my first job, or I was wrapping up my second year, and I wasn't really sure. I liked education, but I still had this performance thing. So I started looking in the military groups.
Hmm.
And I'd gotten really close at one point in time. And then they found out I had asthma very late in the process, and they're like, "Oh, we can't take you." So I don't know if
Yeah,
that's still true, but I was told that we, they don't take me. So
yeah, that and there's weight restrictions too. I remember I was a little worried, like, am I a little too chubby to make it? I think I was okay, but they literally like weigh you on a scale before
oh
you
yeah.
audition. Like they make you take off your shoes and stand on a scale.
Yeah, and so and then I mean I've had all kinds of great experiences. Like so, Fergus Falls, for people that don't know, I would consider it rural, but it's really close to like Fargo Moorhead, which is a really expanding community. And so I've had lots of opportunities to perform there in various ways. And this rural area actually has a lot. It's very arts rich. So there's jazz bands I get to play, and so I get to still feed that bug of performance, and also get to do teaching, which I was told once in college by someone, if you can find something in this world that you would pay to do and then figure out a way to get paid doing it. And I really feel, as cheesy as that is, that I found that, or other people say, I'm living the dream.
Right, right. Yeah, I personally love chamber music. So saxophone quartets are my bread and butter. Like I love playing saxophone quartet music, and
Yeah.
um, I had a great experience as part of my performance degree, being in the saxophone quartet. Where we actually have a YouTube channel, even though we're not really playing together anymore. But we won concerto competitions together, and we almost got a management deal. That was kind of like the pinnacle of my performance. And then when that, like, we were so close, but we were too young, they said. Um, and then that kind of helped me rethink, like, oh well, if I didn't quite get that, maybe I should start looking like. And at the same time, I was already starting to think like I love education, so it kind of merged. And now I still play, like you said, like just for fun, but my passion is definitely music education now.
Okay, this is interesting because like I'm guessing you still perform on saxophone.
Yeah, I mean, not during the pandemic, but prior
Yeah.
to that, like I'm a freelancer. I'm more a classical saxophonist, so I play in churches a lot, and then the saxophone quartet will get gigs every once. I've played at weddings, people who are brave enough to hire saxophones instead of a string quartet, you know.
Okay, so I think this is a really interesting thing that I've never been able to get my finger on. Okay, so I love to perform, but the only time I get really good practice in is when I've got something on the calendar. Um, have you found a way to like, and part of it is just the busyness, like I'm usually at school at 7:30 on a normal year, like getting things ready for the kids, staying late. Have you found a way to incorporate practicing into that part of your day, or is it coming in the bookends of the day?
Yeah, good question. I would say recently it's similar to you, where I don't really practice unless I have a gig scheduled, because then I have that motivation of like, well, I need to practice, and I'll do it on the weekends or maybe find a half hour after school or something, like after the kids leave. Um, but what I used to do, like my first couple years of teaching, when I was still like really invested in performing and just like trying out teaching still, um, is at the end of the day, I would actually like spend an hour or two like playing and recording myself in an empty classroom. And the way I motivated myself was I started a YouTube channel of just soprano saxophone solos, and my goal was to just like record all the etudes and just record every piece out there for soprano sax. And that was my ideal goal, is I'm going to be known as like that soprano sax guy who, if I want to listen to a recording of a soprano sax piece, I'll go to this guy's channel. Um, and after I started that, and I have maybe 10 videos up, and then I just, again, my education passion just kept growing so much that that hour or two of performing just kept getting smaller, because I kept reading more about education and doing more teaching, and it's just kind of it. This grew and this shrank. So I'm still playing every once in a while, but I'm so passionate about education and pedagogy now.
Yeah. Well, and that's an important thing. Like I used to carry guilt, and I don't know. This is kind of a funny thing maybe to some people, but I would look at my trombone and be like, I just didn't have time, and I'd feel guilty because I love doing it so much, and it was like, oh, I'm being a bad example, but it's just the reality of life. And I'm
Mm.
doing this YouTube thing now, and so then that takes time away from whatever kind of practicing I might want to do on whatever it is. But for me, in the end, it's about, one, what can I contribute to whatever I'm doing, and two, like giving myself some joy. And like honestly, right now, these interviews I'm doing with people, like it's so fun to connect with other educators. What are some things that you stand on? Like, what are you like for your teaching?
So I think what really motivates me every day, like I am just all about growth mindset, um, especially with students. Like you were talking about the light bulb moments. Like that is one of my favorite things when, especially with a student who thinks that they're not very musical or thinks that they like, oh, I'll never be able to do that. And then in a few weeks or a few months when you show them like, see how much you've improved, and they're like, oh yeah, remember like a couple months ago when you thought you could never do this, and like that growth mindset is what really motivates me. But I would say in the last couple of years, I've been using that growth mindset and thinking more about how to push just the music education field at large forward. um, I read ever since doing my master's. I feel like the master's degree I did kind of kicked me in the pants and gave me a jump start in how important it is to keep reading and keep learning myself. And now I'm just like when I have time to read, it's almost always pedagogy, music education. I've started reading about language literacy, change theory, like rethinking and innovation, things like that. So I think to answer your question on some of the maybe unique things I'm doing, I think there's probably three areas that I'm really focused on now. And area number one is um, like comprehensive music literacy. Um, Two would be diversity, equity, inclusion, and how do you actually authentically do that in music education? And then assessment, and how to use assessment to learn or to help with learning rather than just to like judge.
Mm.
Uh, so
Yeah. So what is your take on assessment?
yeah, I've read and I've actually written an article last summer all about intrinsic motivation. So I feel like my assessment practices have evolved. I'm an elementary instrumental teacher, so I feel like for years I did the practice journals. And every year they evolved because I used to do the standard, like, 30 minutes, 5 days a week or whatever, and get the parent signature. And then I realized, like, oh, there's so many kids fibbing or lying or writing in their parents' name. Like, that's not actually doing what I want it to do. And then it evolved into like just open blanks on the days and just write in what you did. Like, just like a journal, literally journal what you did, so I can see, like, I'm not telling you how much you have to practice. Anything's better than 0 minutes. Um, and now I think I've just gotten rid of them because it turned out that the kids who were practicing anyways would fill it out, and the kids who struggled with practicing would just never fill it out. And I realized it's because for most of the kids not doing it, there's no intrinsic motivation to do it.
Yeah.
So I started reading and thinking about, well, what can I do to actually intrinsically motivate? And anyway, long story short, that it's changed my assessment practice to be like 90% about self-reflection. So I actually I have like small group lessons with students, and I take 1 week where they would normally have a small group lesson, and I chunk it out where I can meet with each individual student for like a 5-minute student teacher chat. And I'll have like a rubric, and I make the rubric with the students. So we have a class where we kind of like, oh, what do you think we should assess on? And then I'll set that rubric down, and I'll just have a chat with the student. And where do you think you are? And why do you think you're there? And okay, you gave yourself a 3 out of 4. That's pretty good. Like, what do you think you need to do to get to a 4 out of 4? And oh, well, I probably need to practice a couple. Like, oh, that's a good idea. So now the kids are telling me I think I need to practice more rather than me saying you need to practice more. And I've just, when I started doing that, like, again, for me, the light bulb went off and like, man, these kids like are so insightful. And when they come to the conclusion themselves, they're a lot more likely to put in the effort and the work. And I'm also assessing, do they understand where they're at? and do they understand what they need to do to get better? Because sometimes if I say it, it'll just go in one ear and out the other. But if they're saying it, then I know like they probably have a good handle on it because they're telling me. So that's kind of where my assessment has changed, is to focus so much on self-reflection and like one-on-one conversations.
So my realization was with practice charts, the same thing. I mean, like people, everyone's lying. It's not doing anybody any good. And also, it's not really teaching. How many times in college did you go to the practice room and be like, "Oh, I got to practice for 2 hours"?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you maybe did because that's what your schedule allotted, but it's like I've got to get to this. I've got to get to measure 125 of the concerto because it is not working out.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do beginning band. Most of my job is high school, but I do beginning band, and we have a weekly bando sheet. So it's like bingo if you've ever seen them, and it's all about teaching strategies.
Mm-hmm.
And my thought is, we're not even teaching the strategies that go with we're teaching the tool first.
Mm-hmm.
Like one of my favorite things is do tap, top, play for rhythm stuff. And now next year, the goal is then to work on teaching you when to use that tool. So we're trying to build up their belt, their tool belt.
Mm-hmm.
Because I didn't become a good practicer until college, until someone finally explained to me how to practice properly. Yeah.
Same for me.
Yeah. And so like I also pretty much just grade them based on if they turn them in or not, because part of it too is I want to build that responsibility with that thing is, I haven't read it yet. It's on my summer reading list, Drive by Daniel Pink. Have you read
it? I loved it.
Okay. So I wanted to throw that out there. Also, Practice Revolution. You know that one?
That one yet. Would you recommend it?
Yeah, I would recommend it. And it's just filled with it's a lot of the same mindset of finding some intrinsic motivation for students to practice. I don't have my copy in front of me, so I can't tell you who wrote it. But it's filled with like those strategies. We took those strategies in his book and adapted to them for beginning band students, because he's writing it from the sense of a private piano instructor.
Yeah.
But a lot of it's very applicable. So
another assessment book I read that I really liked was Music Assessment for Better Ensembles by Brian Shaw. I think it's fairly recent, like 2018, but he kind of talks about this whole assessment thing and some of the traps that music educators fall into, like practice logs, and how they're not actually doing what we want them to do. And then he gives really insightful suggestions on like what you said, like what is the actual goal and what are we trying to teach them, and here's how you can actually assess for learning rather than just judging. And I think he says in the book something along the lines of, like, research shows that giving kids a poor grade has never motivated a kid to do better. Like when you give a kid a bad grade, it almost always makes them quit because they lose their self-efficacy. So he's like, is that actually what we want to be doing? Or do we want to be showing them that, like, no, you put in effort and you can get better? And if grades are doing the opposite of what we want to do, like maybe we'd be better not even giving a grade. And I'm like, yeah, like what would it be like if I just didn't give grades?
yeah, I mean that's essentially where my master's paper went to. And rubrics I think are awesome. So it sounds like you use rubrics for assessment.
Yeah, I love making them with the kids too.
Yeah, that's really cool. I might have to try to do that next year. We do band karate for kind of our 5th grade assessment, and just kind of way to track how they're doing. And it's all a 4-point rubric, because I think it's very clear on like, this is where it needs to be. This exceeds. It's almost there, and it's deficient in something. So let's go to comprehensive music literacy, because I think I'm going to first ask you, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, well, so to me, my perspective has changed when I've started reading language literacy textbooks. I think I actually went to the reading specialist in my building and said, hey, I want to learn more about language. Like, how do you teach language? Because I have a theory that teaching music is probably similar. And she gave me this textbook, like just best practices and literacy instruction. So it's literally like something you would read in college. So it wasn't like an easy read, but it was really interesting for me to see like an academic approach to language literacy. And it kind of left me thinking that, okay, like let's take Spanish. Like when someone is fluent and is literate in Spanish, like what can they do in Spanish? Well, they can speak Spanish. They can understand when someone speaks to them in Spanish. They can probably write Spanish if they're literate, and then they can read Spanish. So I felt like, well, there's these four areas that English, Spanish, Chinese, like people usually say, like, yeah, if you're literate, you can do those four things. And yet in music, it seems like the prevailing definition of music literacy is just reading notes, which is just one of those four. So I felt like, okay, well, speaking music would be improvising, writing music would be composing, and then understanding music when it's spoken to you would be audiating, which is a word that Gordon invented, I believe, where you can almost like visualize the patterns in your head as you're hearing it, the same way that you could probably visualize the English words I'm saying if you wanted to in your head. So now my approach, and this textbook talks about like those four areas and what language teachers can do to actually help kids be comprehensively literate. So I've started changing my approach to include a ton of improvising. Like when my beginners, when they learn their first three notes, we don't do hot cross buns right away. We do, let's improvise. Like, I'm going to give you a word and you make up a song about a volcano. And like, ooh, like what could you do to make it sound like a volcano? And they're still only using their first three notes. But I'm also introducing creativity because now it's their ideas. And you're kind of killing two birds with one, well, three birds, because they're doing creativity, they're doing improvising, and they're reinforcing the technique of their first three notes. And then composing, once we get pretty confident with using musical patterns, when I introduce what music looks like on the page, I'll immediately say, okay, let's write our own song. And so then they're composing. And audiation is something I've been learning more about because I didn't have it growing up. But I'm learning that singing is so crucial to being able to audiate and understand musical patterns when you hear them. So I've actually started having all of my students in band and orchestra singing their music before they play it. And then I'll call it like, okay, we sang it correctly, now let's translate it onto our instruments. And their intonation has gotten so much better, their sight reading's gotten so much better, because I think they're understanding like comprehensive literacy now rather than just the memorization of this note equals this letter and this finger. Like they're not button pushers anymore.
Yeah.
I feel like my students used to be button pushers.
Yeah, that there's a lot to kind of dig into there.
Yeah.
And I think that we'll have to be careful because we can't be here all day. So here's what I wrote down a bunch of notes because there's some things that are closely tied to what I do. So do you know the David Newell book, Teaching Rhythm?
Yes.
Okay. And if you like, I just started reading it, but then Scott Jones came up with this Emil program for rhythm.
I've heard of it.
Okay.
Yeah, I've seen it online. Yeah.
Yeah. Little self promotion here. I've got a video if you want to check it out because it kind of ties into some of that audiation stuff you're talking about. And I don't know how much I should go into it right now, but basically there's a few different steps to being like rhythmically literate. And that's David Newell's big thing is that a kid can sit down and like figure out the rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it ties back to like language and how we learn language. And we have been just dopes in music education because we're trying to do step 4 and then 3, then 2, then 1.
Yeah, we do theory first when theory should be like grammar is always last in the process. You don't see parents going to their 1-year-old and teaching them like when to put commas.
Yeah. Right. And so that's definitely worth checking out. Emil is a really great program. It's free, and I've been using it with my 5th grade a lot. It's gonna start leaking its way into the high school once I get a chance this summer to like it. There's a lot of time in creating slides that work for the type of rhythm, sequences that you're working on. So the improv thing to me is really important. I had a moment like when I was like, okay, I do this with jazz band because it's important for jazz band, but why doesn't everyone get this? And I'm still not great at doing it with everybody. Um, like I'm giving myself permission just to kind of keep on working on it. Another good book, Improvisation Games by Jeff Agrell. It's actually improvisation games for classical musicians.
Okay.
And just because fifth graders aren't so bad, like they don't have all that built up stuff about I'm not good enough and they want to show off all the time. But as kids get older, they build up that like self-esteem stuff, and so improvisation games can be a lot better than just like, because it gives parameters. It's like this game has rules and you need to work within these rules.
Well, I wonder if part of that is our system of like band and orchestra, like being so like black and white. So then when they get to high school and like now we're going to teach you improvisation, it's so tough for them. So I wonder if we just make improvisation just like normal, just like learning Spanish, like in Spanish immersion, everyone's taught in Spanish and it's normal. It's not like you do textbook Spanish and then when you get to high school, you start speaking Spanish.
Right.
So I wonder if we just did improvisation from the beginning, if it wouldn't be this big scary thing that it was for me. Like I'm a saxophonist, people expect that I know how to improvise. And I'm super square when it comes to improvising because I never had that upbringing. I'm very much the reading the notes correctly. And you want me to just make something up on the spot? Like,
Yeah.
I remember in high school, or even college, that they have the chord names over, and I would just play the letter. Like, oh, it says C, play C, oh, A. And that's so square. So, like, that's not what you're supposed to do, but I couldn't think fast enough to do anything different.
Yeah, and there's definitely a lot of built up, I don't know what the word would be, apprehension about the process, about making mistakes. And I think like in teaching kids to embrace mistakes and learn from them. I mean there's life lessons tied into that.
Another book I would recommend. Oh yeah, have you heard of Music Outside the Lines by Maud Hickey?
No.
So she's an instrumental person. I think she taught at Northwestern. And she's an instrumental person that kind of evolved into this huge improvisation composition teacher. So the book is all about like, okay, you want to teach composition improvisation, but you're not sure how to, like, here's a bunch of ideas. And I took a ton from that book. So
cool. The kind of last thing you had mentioned in those three things is diversity. And this is obviously something that's been more and more of a big topic for us in music education and elsewhere. But I would say for me, I've really felt it the last year, with with getting hints earlier and just being a dope as I am, as like what I'm doing, especially in related to programming artists, and I'm thinking, is that where your thought is with this, or is it broader than that?
I would say it's broader than that. My perspective is that programming more diverse people, composers of different races and sexes, is like a small slice of the pie. And my perspective is like that's still rooted in this. There's a lot more systemic issues to the system of how we teach band and orchestra and choir, and I mean, it's all rooted in this Western European way of doing things. So like I kind of had this thought experiment, like what if what if music ensembles in school were like the default was hip hop? And then you have a student come in who's like, I really want to play violin. Would we say, well, sorry, you have to do the extracurricular classical program because we only do hip hop here. But that's basically what we're doing in reverse. Like we're only doing the white Western European music. And then if a kid wants to do a different kind of instrument or a different genre of music or music from another part of the world, it's either we don't do that, or you have to do it after school, or you have to take private lessons on that instrument. So those kind of systems is what I'm still very new at those two. Like I feel like I'm learning just the tip of the iceberg. But I told my principal I want to think of myself more as an instrumental music teacher rather than a band and orchestra teacher, because I want to be more inclusive of all instruments, of all genres. And when it comes to programming, I mean, I'm open to all types of composers, um, but what if I centered the students? So I'm doing so much improvisation composition. What if like the main part of my concert was student compositions and maybe just one piece that some other person wrote? Or what if my students actually helped me program, and I actually have classes where we'll vote on themes and the students will suggest any song from it. I'll even say like, okay, let's focus on a specific country. Like, what country should we focus on? And like, oh, Japan. Okay, well, okay, let's look up Japanese music. And so it's a very collaborative programming effort. And then the students get a lot of voice and choice in the process. My favorite concert I've done so far, I think I called it the student playlist concert. In the program, I made it look like an iPhone with all the songs that the students had suggested that they wanted to play. And then the audience actually raised their hand and chose a song. And then the students would play that. So it was almost like I was trying to make it like a literal playlist where the audience chooses what they want to listen to and then they get a live performance. But all the music was chosen by the students, and then all the performance order was chosen by the audience. And it was a really fun it went a little long, which I think going forward I have to redo it so it doesn't go quite as long. But yeah, so those are kind of the things I've been thinking about recently.
I'm definitely I'm to the point where I'm like, okay, I need to do something different about programming. It's a little bit different for me too, because I live rurally. There's very low diversity in our schools. And so I see it as an opportunity to show my students diversity and introduce them to those voices and those faces. And I've got another part of my job that I teach at the ALC, and I've been thinking about how I do a better job with, and not just hip hop. There's so many things to pull from, and like obviously very intimidating. So I'm kind of curious, and let's even use maybe hip hop as an example if it's a good one.
Yeah, well, we can use one that I've actually done is Gahu, which is music from Ghana. That's actually music that a couple of years ago I started teaching this, and we actually performed Gahu, which well, it's approximately authentic because you can't actually do authentic Gahu unless you're Ghanese or Ghanaian. So it's approximately authentic, and that includes dancing and chanting and percussion. So I had my band and my orchestra learning how to dance the dance, how to sing and chant the words that they use. And then we blended our Western European instruments into it. So some kids were singing it, but other kids were playing the patterns on their instruments. And then I had students, percussionists and non-percussionists, playing all the different percussion. So that was a unique thing I've tried. I don't really have a lot, if any, students from Ghana. So even though I did that and it was successful, I do want to try to adapt my program to be a little more culturally responsive, in that the types of music are more a reflection of the students in my classroom rather than just me randomly picking a country and a type of music. I think that's one way, but it might be more powerful and more intrinsically motivating if I honed in, like if I started with the students and their backgrounds and cultures and kind of expanded from there.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do we do that in a way that's responsible? Like, and not me being, the white guy that doesn't really know how to do it. Like how did you educate yourself in this so that you did it responsibly? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's how we learn in other areas. So reading about it, I found someone who had lived in Ghana and knew Gahu, and I did it with him. So I had a teacher. And then I think part of it is not being afraid to learn with your students. I don't think teachers always have to be like the sole knowledge giver. I think it's okay to, if I had a student tomorrow say, I really want to learn this traditional Japanese music, I could say, I don't know anything about that, but rather than saying, so we can't do it, I think I would rather say, so let's both dig in and figure it out together. Especially if your goal is that you really want to learn to play this, like, yeah, let's figure it out and I'll learn along with you. I think that's kind of where my approach is now.
Yeah. Yeah. So here's I'm going to answer this question, so it gives you a chance to think about it. But the question is, like, when did you start changing your viewpoint of a more traditional, like, way to approach, everything from what we've talked about with practice charts to this now? I know for me, it was in my getting my master's degree, because I got mine after teaching for about a decade, and it was like there was so much time to be reflective about what I was doing and reading these books and like looking at what I was doing and be like, I believe what this says, but I'm not doing it. And so that's when not only did I start making changes, but the big thing was being more open to change. And that always, like, is this effective? Is this the best thing to do? And I feel like for me, that's the best way I can be my best as a teacher, is to not beat myself up, because it's really easy to do that, but to be reflective about what I'm doing. So what about you? Like, when did your teaching maybe start changing away from more traditional things?
Yeah, good question. I feel like I'm probably similar to you, where I try to have more of a mindset of a scientist, where striving towards the truth and what's best, but realizing that I'm still learning and I'm still growing. And I feel like earlier in my career, I definitely had a bigger ego of thinking I knew I was a great performer and I went to this great music school, Lawrence University, and I knew what I was doing. And I was still slightly interested in growing, but like, I'm already pretty good. And so I think similar to you is my master's, which I did about 6 or 7 years into my teaching. And it was that thing of the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. And I think for me, it was really reading Edwin Gordon, who's the guy all about audiation. That was probably the biggest shock to my system of like, holy cow, like there's this whole philosophy I never even heard of that's grounded in research and science. So like I can't really argue against it because there's all this evidence to back it up. And like, man, like what he's advocating for is like a 180 of what I'm doing. So that caused me to want to dig deeper, and I started reading more research and more authors. And um, so I think what you were saying was just being open to learning more and adapting. And I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, my program changes every year. Like because I actually have an Excel document that I call my teacher ideas. And anytime I read something or hear from another educator or observe something, I'll just add it to my teacher ideas list. And like, oh, maybe this is the year that I do this. And like, oh, yeah, what was this about? And oh, yeah, I should try that this year. And so every year my approach changes.
Yeah.
And I feel like it gets better each year.
Yeah. And I maybe don't want to cast judgment on people that don't approach it like that, because I think there's a gajillion different ways to approach our teaching. But I honestly can't imagine that not, like self-reflection is so important and constantly changing, because our students are constantly changing. I've been teaching now for 17, I think this would be 17 or 18 years, and things have changed so much in that time, and my students have that, and I'm thankful for it, because like it's evolution is good. So, and you mentioned the word ego, and I laughed, because I don't know how many of us, but I know me for sure, like it wasn't until I started learning more about education that I realized what I didn't know. Kind of
Well,
like,
I'm also a saxophonist, and we're known for having the biggest egos.
and um, I sometimes kick myself, but again, I try to give myself some grace. But my ego got in my way so many times, and if I wish I had learned to kick it a little bit sooner. But in the end, I guess I've hopefully been able to keep it in check. Now, I've probably, if I've got any colleagues watching this video, they're probably shaking their head going, no, he hasn't figured it out yet. But
Yeah, well, and I think if we have a growth mindset, like that's the healthiest approach is, like you said, keep being reflective, keep growing. I know for me, I mentioned how K through 12, I grew up in parochial schools, and it was an evangelical synod. So I feel like that evangelizing-ness is ingrained in me, for better or for worse. And well, for worse in this instance, because I feel like my tendency is to want to preach, especially when I learn like all this awesome stuff that I learned in my master's, and I just want to go out and tell everyone like, isn't this awesome? And I've learned that that can sometimes push people away. So I'm learning how to be less of a preacher and more of a scientist, like I said, where you're striving for the truth, towards the truth, but listening to other ideas and being skeptical and rethinking. And even though I think this approach is really working, like I'm still open to rethinking about it and having a debate about it. So I feel like that's the journey I'm really focusing on right
Yeah,
now.
and another one too for me is that I've really learned, I think in the last 2 years, to accept that the things that work really well for me right now in my school district with my students aren't always going to work for you, you know? And like, because I've done that before too, was like, no, this is a really good idea. You have to do it. And I know they're thinking, no, I know my students and I know my
Yeah.
school and this isn't going to work
Right.
right now. You're a super creative educator, obviously super curious about, I love the idea of the science lab too. I've had other people tell me that too. Shouldn't be afraid to go and experiment, you know, go and try something and go write your field notes and decide what worked and what didn't work. I think that we have many more conversations in our future. When I'm down in your area, we're gonna connect face to face and bend an elbow or get a cup of coffee or something.
Perfect. And because I'm originally from Wisconsin, can you remind where is Fergus Falls?
Um, Northwestern Minnesota, right along the Canadian border.
Oh, okay. Wow. So
I'm
you're
sorry, not Canadian. I don't. I'm doing two things at once. Right along the North Dakota border.
okay. So like how far away from like Fargo?
An hour.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've never been to that part of the state, but if I'm there, I'll look you up.
We've hosted the state MBDA festival before, and there's a little bit of, you know, this is actually a little while ago, the talk that we might do it again. So
Nice.
yeah.
Cool. Well, I agree. It's a great pleasure to get to chat with you and learn from you, and I definitely look forward to future conversations.
Yeah, same. Thanks a lot, David. Have a great day.
Thanks, you too.